My name is Heather Otis from the Marco Island Historical Society, and we are just thrilled to have Caren Neile back with us today. Caren has taught storytelling studies at Florida Atlantic University for 20 years. A performing storyteller, she's worked in 13 states and 7 countries, including as a Fulbright Senior Specialist in Vienna and Jerusalem. Dr. Neile's publications include the books Florida Lore and Only in Florida, and a chapter in the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Folk and Folk Life Studies. She also co-hosts the Public Storyteller segment on Miami Public Radio WLRN. And today, she is bringing all of you fabulous fictional Florida. Douglas, Rawlings, Hurston, Hemingway. These are not simply the names of iconic authors, they are the names of iconic Florida authors. Today's program invites you to listen to interpretive readings of passages from great Florida books, learn the life stories of their creators, and come to love Florida literature through a lively analysis by Neile of what makes these stories come to life. Before I pass it over to Caren, I do want to say that as a storyteller, she will not be doing a Q&A session at the end. She'd like to engage the audience throughout with questions. So she'll be pausing periodically to answer any questions you may have. And if you're new to Zoom webinar, that's okay. I want you to check out the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's where you can type any questions that you have. So please make sure to give Caren a shout out if any question pops in your head throughout the program. And that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Caren.
Right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Now, some people may think that a presentation about fabulous fictional Florida is a contradiction in terms. After all, we don't think of Florida as being exactly a hotbed, most of us, many of us, a hotbed of literary creation, of the cultural arts. That is not what we're known for. As much as I was talking to Patricia before we started, and I said, I've been in the state 39 years. I love the state. I can't imagine ever leaving. But where I came from up north, there was a lot more culture that just out the door. There were a lot more people who were interested in reading as opposed to, oh, I don't know, scuba diving. But what I have found is if you look a little bit, there's all kinds of culture that is native to the state. Maybe there are a lot of people who are not native to the state, particularly people over the age of 30, but there is so much culture that is native to the state, and so much of what I focus on in my new book. It hasn't come out yet, but I am working on it. I'm under contract with History Press, with which I did the 2 books that Patricia mentioned, to write a book about Florida fiction. I was thinking of calling it, and I want you to all vote. You know, Johnny Carson did this once on the Oscars with wallpaper, his kitchen wallpaper. I want you all to vote on what title you like best. I would really appreciate it. But I was thinking fabulous fictional Florida. I was also thinking imagining Florida. There was something that was so, I don't know, magical about the word imagining. So what I'm going to be doing today is not exactly what's in the book. I'm going to be, as you heard, I'm going to be reading to you some passages, but I'm also going to be talking about these books and about the background or these TV shows and why they are important. So in other words, it's what I am working on, what you're helping me, I appreciate so much, what you're helping me work on as I'm discussing this topic is not just, oh, these books exist, but why are these books and TV shows important? What do they bring to the conversation about Florida? So it wasn't just willy-nilly, they just happened to be set in Florida. Some of them weren't even shot in Florida, but some of the movies or TV shows. But why is Florida chosen, and what do they say about it? So I want to read you just a little bit of the introduction And this is all a work in progress. So I'd love to discuss this with you. I have the chat open and I'm very happy to take questions and comments from any of you. Let's face it, I begin. Florida, and this is how I started talking to you, Florida is not the first US state you think of when you're talking about literature. The state has a long tradition, after all, of cattle ranching and other agricultural pursuits. And tourists come down more for recreation than for any intellectual stimulation. The cracker culture, and of course we who have lived in Florida a while know that that is not a put down in any way. It means primarily people of English descent who came down often from Georgia and from other places in the South. The cracker culture brought down by the Civil War refugees from Georgia, the climate, the sunshine itself do not exactly lend itself to reading books in dusty libraries or to snuggling up by the fire, right? And enjoying your favorite volume. Nevertheless, there is one sensational reason why so much interesting content, we're going to go through a lot of it today, has emerged from Florida over the past 100 years or so. And that reason is Florida itself. In short, the frontier history lent itself very well to a kind of, you might say, Little House on the Prairie in the Swamps kind of book or movie, as well as Al Capone on the Skids. So we've got Little House on the Prairie on the Swamps, Al Capone on the Skids. The sheer distance from well-heeled New York or Yankee elites was too tempting for con men to resist something like real estate fraud. I got some farmland, I got some prime swampland in Florida to sell you. The balmy weather and low taxes beckoned Northern retirees, as well as models and photo shoots. More recently, as we know, the proximity to Cuba helped in part, not all of it, but helped in part usher in the drug trade in the early 1980s. For many people in North and South America, Florida represents in one way or another the wild, wild East. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. And the first one is not going to be something that is a book. It's going to be something, whoops, did I just lose my share there? It's going to be a TV show that we all know about. It's there we go. I'm just moving this away. My image is, of course, of the very, very famous people. Who are these people? Anybody? They were Crocker and Tubbs. Crocker and Tubbs from what TV show? Could you see that? Patricia, you could, oh, you couldn't see that either. Sorry, it didn't work. I'm sorry about that, but I won't worry about it too much. Don't you worry about it too much. It was a picture of Crocker and Tubbs from what TV show? Miami Vice, right? Now, why am I starting with Miami Vice? We have such classics, and I already discussed when we were planning this that I'm going to go not only to the classics, a couple of classics, but also to the modern cult movies or TV shows or classics. Why Miami Vice? Because it is a wonderful example of one of the things that this book and this presentation is about. And that is, you know how we say often the expression, truth is stranger than fiction, right? Well, in Florida fiction is often creating Florida truth. So Miami Vice, more than almost anything else I'm going to talk about today, and this is why I start with it, is one of those examples of life following art, right? What do I mean by that? Well, I called this chapter, "The City is Mine." You Belong to the City was one of the songs they played all the time. And so I called the chapter "The City is Mine." These are very short entries. I should say entries rather than chapters. Anybody know how long the series aired, when the series aired? Anybody want to respond to that? Can't type fast enough, huh? Oh, from the 80s. Thank you. Yes. And it was 1984 to 1989. And interestingly enough, or not so coincidentally, the Mariel boat lift and the rising. And again, I always need to point out, although I'm sure you all know this, not every Cuban who came over was a criminal. Not every Cuban who came over was a drug dealer. Of course not. But there is a connection between the cocaine trade in Miami and the Mariel boat lift, whether it is direct or indirect. And that was in 1983. And this show began in 1984. It starred Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas, where it's gorgeous. I mean, let's face it, they were very good looking guys, still are from what I've seen. Gorgeous men, gorgeous cars, that Testarossa, gorgeous women, gorgeous setting. And what did that gorgeous setting and photography, I should say, cinematography, and music. This was the first time that big stars had their songs on a TV show. This was a very big deal. All of this combined to really put Miami on the modern day map. Of course, people visited their grandparents in Miami. Of course, people retired there. But this gave Miami, particularly Miami Beach, a whole new image. So very quickly, I'm going to go through what I wrote about Miami Vice. The word on Miami Vice is that in one of those interesting examples of life imitating art, the iconic TV show supposedly made Miami what it is today. To be sure, the award-winning series ushered in a new level of cool with celebrity culture, and I'll read you the list of all the celebrities who are on this. Pricey, perfect pastel-colored buildings on South Beach. And those of you who've been over to this side of this state know very well what South Beach looks like today. It is pricey, pristine, and pastel colored, and an emphasis on popular music, style, and fashion, hitherto unknown in the Magic City. And did I mention crime? In fact, when it came to crime, art very much imitated life. Antisocial behavior was a popular Miami activity long before Vice co-producer Anthony Yurkovich, called the city a sort of, and this is a quote, I love this quote, a sort of Barbary Coast, that is the pirates, of free enterprise gone berserk. In the late 1920s, of course, it was the winter home of legendary Chicago mobster Al Capone, who died in his Palm Island mansion, which is part of Miami proper, in 1947. You may not have known that Ma Barker also spent some time there, and not too distant neighbors engaged in speakeasies, rum running, piracy, and other illicit activity. And one of the masterpieces that I write about in this book is Shadowlands by Peter Matheson, writing about a terrible murder that was going on in the around the Thousand Island area in Southeast Florida. Cuba's strongman Fidel Castro's 1983 export of nearly 125,000 of his people, known as the Mariel boat lift, helped him empty out the streets and prisons of political protesters and bona fide criminals, expanding the entrenched upper-class Cuban and Central American communities with their often easy access to cocaine and other illegal substances. Again, not all the criminals. Enter Sonny Crockett and former New Yorker Ricardo Rico Tubbs, who tooled around, as you will recall, in designer suits and a white Ferrari Testarossa. I never knew the word Testarossa before Miami Vice came out. Thanks to asset forfeiture statutes, meaning, well, I'll tell you in a minute, which allowed their department, Vice, to hold on to the ill-gotten gains of drug lords. So that's how they could explain the gorgeous cars they drove, and it wasn't just the Ferrari, the gorgeous clothes, the amazing places they lived. How do they explain it away? But these are cops. Well, the asset forfeiture laws. In fact, it was those statutes that gave creators the idea for the series in the first place, because they could make it look so great. Great looking cops, great looking location, fabulous lifestyle. Now, I mentioned celebrity culture. As for the celebrities, the show was so hit that not only did it inspire well-known musicians such as Miles Davis, Glenn Frey, Isaac Hayes, Leonard Cohen, the list goes on and on, Phil Collins, Little Richard. It inspired them to take on a life of fictional crime, but it also brought in future A-listers. So people who were not big stars at the time necessarily, or had just become stars: Helena Bonham Carter, Bruce Willis, Julia Roberts, Benicio del Toro, Viggo Mortensen, Chris Rock, and this is my favorite, in a speaking role, the famously mute teller of the magic act, Penn and Teller. He's the one who does, the short one who doesn't say a word ever, but he had a speaking role in Miami Vice. It's like Garbo talks, well, Teller talked. No doubt about it, Miami Vice changed television. And one of the ways was that things began to look so gorgeous. And other shows, they used much better production values than they had in, say, Mannix. And for these songs, for the rights to these popular songs, these up-to-the-minute popular songs, they paid as much as $10,000, which in the 80s was huge. But anybody who watched it, or if you look, I have to admit, I did not watch it at the time, full confession, but I watched every single thing I could find in order to write this and to research this. So I watched many, many, many clips and episodes of this show. Here's some fun facts. I always like to include at the end of my little entries some fun facts. Here's some of the names of actors who almost became Crockett, Sonny Crockett: Nick Nolte, Mickey Rourke, the guy from Chips, Larry Wilcox, and Jeff Bridges. I think it would have been a very different show with Jeff Bridges, for example. Very different kind of actor, a lot more, for one thing, gravitas, I think. Nick Nolte, certainly it would have been different. Now, Mark Harmon was all ready to replace Johnson, but that was because Johnson fought his contract after the second season. He wanted more. He saw this was a huge hit and he wanted more, but at the 11th hour, he and the network agreed to terms. And my favorite fun fact of all, the Ray-Ban Wayfarer, that classic Ray-Ban sunglass. I meant to bring it in from my car. I actually have a pair. The sales of those sunglasses skyrocketed after Crockett wore a pair. It was added to his standard wardrobe. So these are the ways in which life really imitated art. When it came to Miami Vice, it was seminal not only in hastening the end of the South Beach of elderly women walking with walkers down the street and our grandparents, many people's grandparents living there. And it brought in the models, the drugs, the very shiny, the Madonnas, the shiny people, and the cool, classy vibe to the area. So it was a little bit of parallel processing. It was maybe on its way when they chose Miami Vice, but Miami Vice absolutely hastened it along. Now, I want to switch to another topic, if I may. Crime definitely pays in South Florida literature, but I want to read to you from a book that we are going to be looking at today. I've got so many things here to talk to you about, but I think we'll focus on A Land Remembered. Now, I am switching from hip 19, you may get whiplash here, from hip 1980s South Beach to an area very different, not far from present day Disney World, that was the milieu of A Land Remembered. This book came out in 1984. It's been called Florida's favorite book, the true Florida book. Patrick D. Smith, its author, had written books before. By the way, he was one of the writers of very classic Florida books, including Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, and including The Yearling by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. These are the three big fictional contributions on Florida books, the three real classic books about old-time Florida. None of the three of them was born in Florida. I, for years, thought that Zora Neale Hurston was. She came to Eatonville, by the way, as a young girl, but she was a very young child, but she was not born in Florida. So I want to read you first a little bit about what I wrote about A Land Remembered, and then I'm going to read you some of the text. If you have read the book or very familiar with the book, I would love you to weigh in. Unless before I run over to A Land Remembered, remember, you can always ask me questions about Miami Vice or anything else as we go along. So I call this chapter A Land Well Loved. And again, remember that my point in what we're doing today is not simply to introduce you to, or to reintroduce you, remind you of great Florida fiction, but also to make those connections. Why exactly are these books so important? And this is one of my favorites for that. It's Florida's answer to Gone with the Wind, minus, for better or for worse, Scarlett O'Hara. A Land Remembered is the epic tale of poor Georgia crackers. And as I alluded to before, a lot of people came from Georgia as refugees, so to speak, from the state after the Civil War, because their plantations were destroyed, their home, there was nothing left for them. So a lot of them came to Florida at that time. And that was a big impetus to cracker culture. But these people came before the war. Not incidentally a derogatory term, I remind readers, who came to Central Florida a few years before the Civil War and make good and then bad over the next century or so. So it's a 3-generation story. It's quite an epic tale. Smith had displayed his knowledge of poverty and of the Seminole tribe, both of which feature in this book, in previous historical novels, but it was Land that became an international bestseller, and for good reason. For one thing, its chief protagonist, and anybody who loves literature has probably heard a literature teacher or somebody talk about this before, its chief protagonist was its unforgettable setting. And you may recall books or movies where you've seen where really the most important thing, and you could add Miami Vice into that, the most important thing is the place. It wouldn't be the same book or movie without the place. So people often say the most important character was not a character, it was the setting. Like his fictional settlers, Tobias McIvy, his wife Emma, and his one-year-old Zechariah, Smith was not a Florida native. Born in a tiny town in Mississippi, he moved to Florida in 1966 at the age of 39. Yet his ability to capture the spirit of the wilderness when Florida was one of America's last frontiers, and these are his words in an interview I saw of his, Florida was eaten alive with mosquitoes, snakes, alligators, bears, panthers, wolves, swamps. The heat rivaled that of another famous non-native. That's easier. That kind of long sentence is easier to read than to hear. So his research into this place rivaled that of another non-native, the yearling author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. So also, as I write about, we may or may not get to today, she also made that come alive. It's unbelievable that she didn't come to Florida till she was an adult. Her research was uncanny. As Smith described the time, it was some kind of rough. That's a quote, some kind of rough. Land, remembered, stands out and has long been assigned in Florida high schools, and even an abridged version is assigned to younger kids, due to the ways in which the descendants of Tobias, who himself had a great love and respect for the land, exploited it for personal gain. So it is a cautionary tale. One character reflects on how there was a time when people, like animals, only took from the land what they needed. And this character envisioned a time when humankind would destroy the earth. Sounds a little prescient, doesn't it? In fact, the latter passages of the book, actually, I found them, having been in Florida as long as I have, a little difficult for lovers of the state to get through, especially when they realized that the McIvy's land was within spitting distance of present-day Disney World. Now, I am not going to say anything against Disney World. All I'm saying is times have changed. The way I put it was they sometimes read like a how-to manual on pillaging the earth. Actually, some reviewer mentioned that, and I kind of rework that. You'll see, going from a land of humus, I think that's how you pronounce soil, where there was the soil with the detritus of leaves and animals and, wild ground, to concrete. You'll see I do mention that. Smith well knew that the Florida that supplied the Confederate Army with beef from cattle left over from the Spanish occupation was long gone by the time he wrote this book. This was 1984. A lot of that, there were certainly pockets there that still, but that these cattle roamed a lot of the state, no more. He knew that many of those who worked to preserve the land were the offspring of these Georgia refugees. He knew that values and attitudes had to change with a foundation of concrete rather than soil. But he also liked to think that maybe, just maybe, some of the land developers who told him they loved the book may have been influenced to preserve what is left of the natural landscape. And he also hoped that some of the legislators he talked to felt that way too. And I end the chapter by saying that he noted that one of those developers actually named a subdivision a land remembered. So if you're going to name a subdivision after a book that is a cautionary tale about development, you'd like to think that you were a a developer who wanted to preserve the land, right? I ended with a couple of fun facts. One of them was that the research for the novel took 2 years. I can't believe it only took 2 years. It's just uncanny what he did, because he also had to write it, right? And the other is that the book was challenged, not banned, but challenged by the Indian River County School District. That's Vero Beach on this coast in 2003 for some racially offensive language, which, you know, we know this happened with Mark Twain's books as well. There are all kinds of things that were said, and you can be for or against. I'm not making a political statement here. I'm just saying it wasn't Patrick Smith being racist. It was the language that people spoke. So I'm just going to turn to a little section here, read you a little bit. Tobias, this is the man who came in the first place, left before breakfast the next morning. Zek wanted to come with him, but he said no, he would do this alone. If there was a way through the swamp, he would find it and come back as soon as possible. He approached the line of cypress trees reluctantly, walking the horse slowly, looking back at the grazing herd and at the wagon beyond. It seemed to him that all this land they had moved over for 3 days was a funnel, directing them to this one impassable spot. His instinct was to turn back now, to backtrack the herd and leave this place as hurriedly as possible. But he walked the horse straight into the woods. The land looked the same as where the cows buried themselves: towering bald cypress, thick clumps of lush ferns, fallen rotten limbs covered with moss, palmetto clumps, and cocoa plum bushes. There were also pools of stagnant water covered with slime, cut in places by moccasin trails. Tobias followed a small ridge of higher ground, moving gingerly, remembering what happened to the cows that ran into the sinkhole muck. I don't have to tell you what happened to them. He already knew that there was no way to move cattle through here, but he did not turn back. He was a mile into the swamp when he heard it. The bells, the one thing he had come looking for, not a passage for the herd, but for the strange sound that had come out of the night. It was off to the right, no more than 100 yards distant, tinkling, moving and then stopping, then moving again. He sat in the saddle, mesmerized, not thinking of the herd or of Emma or Zek or anything but the bells, somehow knowing that if he sat still, it would come to him. The horse whinnied and backed away a few steps as the sound grew louder. Then it came past the last clump of palmetto and stood before him. The man was beyond age, so old that his skin was cracked like alligator hide. He was almost 7 feet tall, and his hair was tied on top of his head with hands of reeds, making him seem even taller. He wore only a girdle of silver-colored balls and small brass bells, and around his neck there were 6 strings of shells. His wrists were covered with bracelets of fish teeth, and his entire body was stained red. Tobias stared, unbelieving at first, and then believing, but feeling no fear. He knew this was not an apparition or a hallucination, but a man, a flesh and blood man beneath all those strange trappings. There was a calmness about him that dissipated fear, making Tobias calm too. an overwhelming calmness that flooded his body and caused him to slump forward in the saddle. For several moments, no word was spoken. And then the old man said, I am a Timucuan, the last of my people. I am the keeper of the graves. Soon I will join the others. We came here a long time ago to hide from the Spanish soldiers. I am the only one left, and I have lived beyond my time. Tobias said, we didn't know. We're lost and trying to find a passage for the herd. Do not bring your cows in here, the old man cautioned, and here there is only death. If you come in here, you will never return. Go back the way you came. This swamp is a burial ground for all who enter. My people have known this to be true. Is there no other way? We're trying to reach the sea to the west. If we turn back, it means 3 or 4 days of traveling. It is best that you travel those days. Only death awaits you if you enter. Do not go into the south swamp either. Go all the way back and around the swamp. It is the only way. Without speaking further, the old man turned and walked away. Tobias wondered if he had really seen this or not, but as he listened to the bells fading into the distance, he knew. Zek rode to him swiftly as soon as he emerged from the woods. He asked anxiously, did you find it, Papa? Find what? Tobias responded abruptly. A way to get through. There is no way to get through. We'll have to turn the herd and go back. It's the only way. The bells, Papa. Did you find the bells? It was the wind, only the wind. Ride on ahead and tell the men to move the cows out of here right away. Hurry now. And here's the last paragraph of this section. Tobias sat still for several minutes, thinking of the old man who had been in there alone for such a long time. Then he put his horse into a trot and headed for the herd. Any comments or questions? Or what did you think about the writing? What'd you think about the details? What'd you think about any aspect of that? Anybody have a thought? I'll give you a couple of breaths before we move on. Okay, well, feel free to chat or let us know anyway, anytime. Oh, I see something. I can't wait to read the whole book. You have not read the whole book. You are in for something wonderful. It truly has stood up to time, this book. It really is very, very interesting. And now we'll move on. Let's move on to another topic. I had 3 general topics I wanted to talk to you about today. And I think we'll have time for at least 3. I'd love to read you another something, but this is another TV show. A TV show is, oh, actually, you know what? I'll do this and maybe something else. I think we'll have time to read something else. Miami Not Always So Nice is what I called the chapter, the entry, The Golden Girls. Okay, how many people watch The Golden Girls? When was that on? Even longer than Crocker and Tubbs' Miami Vice. It was on 1985 to 1992. And the reason that I wrote about this sitcom, you'll find out in a minute, but the reason that I called it Miami Not Always So Nice is because at the time this came out, remember I said that Miami Vice came out in 84. This came out in 85. And when Miami Vice was all the bad guys, they called Golden Girls Miami Nice. I have read the whole book. Oh, good, wonderful. I don't see more of that. I've read the whole book. It's wonderful. Tobias was wonderful to follow. Does the name Tobias have a particular meaning? I should know this. It is a biblical name, and absolutely. And I don't think it is a fairly well-known name. There's a great author, Tobias Wolff, for example, but I don't know the derivation of the name. I'm sorry. But it wasn't just that he picked that name. At the time, a lot of people had biblical names. Zechariah was a biblical name. And so it kind of followed that it kind of was natural that he might have a biblical name as well. All right, from the biblical from the sacred to the not so sacred. Miami, not always so nice. The Golden Girls featured, of course, B. Arthur was the star, the grande dame, tall and deep voiced and gray hair, you remember. You remember her from Maude, of course. Estelle Getty, Rue McClanahan, and Betty White, one of the ultimate ensemble shows. I was watching the Netflix streaming of the SAG-AFTRA Awards last night, and they give an award for ensemble cast. And this was one of the ultimate, but you're going to find out a few things that were between the lines or behind the scenes here. I hate to burst your bubble. If you thought that this was Miami Nice, you might want to turn off the sound. You might want to mute me for this. Bad blood between actors in an ensemble cast, slut shaming, mocking a star's appearance, incipient dementia, racist tropes. For a sitcom that was originally conceived as Miami Nice, the CBS mega hit known as The Golden Girls was sometimes anything but. The 7 seasons and 180 episodes that aired from 1985 to 92 presented more than their share of bad blood, both on and off screen. Pretty interesting for a show with a theme song. Anybody remember the theme song? Thank you for being a friend. The concept was simple. 3 widows, 2 in their 60s, 1 80, and the 80-year-old's 55-year-old divorcee daughter, that was the B. Arthur role, share a home in Miami. One widow is a Southern sex pot. Another is an airheaded farm girl. The eldest is a tough-talking Italian, and her daughter is intelligent, touchy, and for the record, I'm just going to say relatively unattractive. You'll find out why I say that. What could possibly go wrong? For one thing, B. Arthur and co-star Betty White did not get along. They worked together fine, but their personalities and acting styles led to more than one clash, ongoing tension behind the scenes, offset. Rue McClanahan's Blanche Deborah was the butt, excuse the expression, of hundreds of jokes about her promiscuity. At the height of the AIDS crisis, not so cool, which interestingly was addressed and handled very sensitively in the show. And B. Arthur, it must have been hard being B. Arthur, you know, in life with all these gorgeous actresses who had classic kinds, or not so classic, but trendy kinds of beauty. B. Arthur threatened to quit if jokes about her character's appearance were not toned down. So they were. Nevertheless, she did decide to leave and the show folded. There was a sequel called Golden Palace, but it never spun off very well. A spin-off, but it never really worked without her. Estelle Getty began her role as B. Arthur's mother. She was actually a year younger than B. Arthur, as 80-year-old Sophia Petrillo at age 62. She suffered from crippling stage fright, and you may or may not know, so has Barbra Streisand all her life and several other very famous people. Her stage fright was so terrible that she also had early onset or fairly early onset dementia, and together with the onset of dementia, made it so difficult to learn her lines, she eventually had to resort to cue cards. Very, very sad, particularly in a show about retirees living the golden years, right? Then there was the interracial marriage episode. In the midst of this episode, Blanche and Rose wore mud masks, to fix their, complexion. And they came out of the bathroom saying, "We're not Black." Now, at the time that it ran, that was perfectly fine. It was a joke. But afterwards, in present day time, Hulu temporarily blocked that episode because people were making complaints. It was kind of like blackface, like the Al Jolson type of blackface that is absolutely not cool anymore. And yet, all four lead actresses won Primetime Emmys. The show was in the Nielsen's top 10 ratings for 6 out of its 7 years. And it made it to TV Guide's 60 best series of all times. It won 2 Primetime Emmys for Outstanding Comedy Series, 3 Golden Globes. I mean, it really won so many awards, and it tackled important issues of its time, not only retirement, but death, assisted suicide, elder care, age discrimination, bad medical care for seniors, poor medical care, and poverty. In other words, I end the chapter, a blue-haired Sex in the City. It wasn't. It had real serious themes between the comedy. Here's some fun facts. The Tony-winning Broadway phenom, the big star Elaine Stritch, who was in Company on Broadway, failed the audition for the part of Dorothy. By the way, speaking of Dorothy, the women used to get together, you may recall, for cheesecake after the episodes. The author hated, not after, during the episodes. At the end of the show, this was a thing. They all sat together and had cheesecake in the kitchen. She hated cheesecake. And as I told you, she was actually a year older than her fictional mom, Estelle Getty's character, who, by the way, had to spend 3 hours in makeup each day to achieve that look. And finally, it was considered at one point that Rue McClanahan and Betty White, the sexpot and the airhead, would switch roles, that they would take on each other's roles, not in the middle of filming, but while they were casting it. And that's an interesting thing to think of, these iconic characters in these different roles. So why was this an important thing, an important show? I think it was an important show because at the time, people thought of seniors coming to Florida as playing shuffleboard, as going to their doctors every day, as waiting with bated breath for the grandchildren. And this could not have been further from the case with these 4 women. They had their moments, their senior moments, let's say, but they were also dating. They were also experimenting with youth culture in different ways. And they were having fun. They were making jokes. These were not old women to feel sorry for. These were women who were making the most of that era, that part of their lives, that decade or 2 of their lives. And that was revolutionary. Now, today, we see that all the time. Another, in Florida, another book that I wrote about for the book I'm writing is Recessional. And if you get a chance, I didn't love the book, I must say, but many people did. It's a recent James Michener book. James Michener, who wrote Hawaii and The Source and many other bestsellers. He wrote it in 1994, so it's not that recent, but it's more recent than The Source and Hawaii. And it was at a time when fantastic senior living residences were relatively new, where people thought people moved into nursing homes. So in 1994, this story of a nursing home on the southwest, near the Tampa St. Pete area, and 400 pages of what it was like to live in that nursing home and to work in that nursing home was completely revolutionary. Or if not completely, it was certainly much more revolutionary than 30 years later. Today, you're saying, I'm reading this book saying, so they dated, so they were brilliant people. Well, of course, why wouldn't they be? But again, at the time, it was a very big deal to put this in literature. and and these places were very new, these gorgeous places. There were always some places were over 55, not always, but there have long been over 55 communities, certainly. In the 80s there were, but this kind of luxury was of assisted living and independent living and hospice care communities. These were relatively new. We have very little time left, I'm afraid. I wanted to talk to you about another Florida classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God. I will just spend 5 minutes. It's a crime, but to spend 5 minutes on this. Does anybody have any comments or questions? I had several books to read you, but there's so much to say on this topic. Their Eyes Were Watching God was written by Zora Neale Hurston in 1937. It tells, and this was my title for the entry, telling the Black Florida story. It tells about people in and around Eatonville, Florida, which is a real place, and she has fictionalized Eatonville, Florida. Eatonville, Florida was a place for Blacks by Blacks. It was a Black-owned town in the 30s. As she was not born there, but she spent much of her life there. She was a Columbia University-trained anthropologist, very well-educated person who decided to turn her gaze, her literary gaze and her academic gaze on her own people. And she was shunned. She was really disliked for this by the elite, the northern elite of what was called at the time the Harlem Renaissance, which was a cultural sort of celebration of what they called the new Negro. That was their term. People like W.E. Du Bois and Richard Wright, who are both written about and read today, as is she. But what Hurston decided to do was have these people talk in their real dialect and have these people live in a town where they weren't so much confronting racism. You could say their poverty caused them to confront racism, but we really see them in a very different way than the people from the Harlem Renaissance wanted to be seen. So very, very quickly, I'm just going to read you some dialogue from this book so that you get a sense, and then we'll wind up. There's so much. I wanted to start a chapter with dialogue here. Okay, we'll get to dialogue very quickly. On the train, Joe didn't make many speeches with rhymes to her, but he bought her the best things the butcher had. By the way, this is the story of Janie, who was born poor, has 3 husbands, and they are in some ways similar in that they're all pretty sexist. In other ways, very different. They treat her very differently. And she's a very independent woman. Joe didn't make many speeches with rhymes to her, but he bought her the best things the butcher had, like apples and a glass lantern full of candies. Mostly, he talked about plans for the town when he got there. They were bound to need somebody like him. Janie took a lot of looks at him, and she was proud of what she saw. Kind of portly, like rich white folks. Strange trains and people and places didn't scare him neither. Where they got off the train at Maitland, he found a buggy to carry them over to the colored town right away. And of course, this is her language. It was early in the afternoon when they got there, so Joe said they must walk over to the place and look around. They locked arms and strolled from end to end of the town. Joe noted the scant dozen of shamefaced houses scattered in the sand and palmetto roots and said, God, they call this a town? Why, 'tain't nothing but a raw place in de woods. It is a whole heap littler than I thought, Janie admitted her disappointment. Just like I thought, Joe said, a whole heap of talk and nobody doing nothing. My God, where's the mayor? He asked somebody. I want to speak with the mayor. 2 men who were sitting on their shoulder blades under a huge live oak tree almost sat upright at the tone of his voice. They stared at Joe's face, his clothes, and his wife. Where y'all come from in such a big haste? Middle Georgie, Starks answered briskly. Joe Starks is my name from in and through Georgie. So you see, this was a very different kind of representation of Blacks than the Harlem Renaissance writers wanted from Harlem, that's Manhattan, New York City. They wanted to represent their people as in every bit as educated and every bit, well, listen, there were some people who weren't, and she wanted to represent her people the way they were, and they were farmers, they were migrant farmers, they were poor, and she puts forth that world very beautifully. I will also say that there is a hurricane scene based on the 1928 hurricane that is not to be believed. It is a gorgeous book, and there's a reason this book has lasted so long. Speaking of lasting long, we are done. And I will just finish my presentation by saying that writing this book and doing these presentations is such an honor for me because it's such an education. Anytime a writer writes, if you don't learn something, you're in trouble. But also, it's given me more and more admiration for our Florida writers and for what they're writing about, for the content, for the main character, Florida. Thank you, Patricia.